Welcome to American History 1302. In this presentation, we'll be talking about American imperialism 1898 to 1920. I always try to begin with a thesis statement, and our thesis statement here is very simple. Americans are bad imperialists. We're very bad at it. But we had to give it a try before we can understand that we're bad at it. The contents of this presentation include the Spanish-American War. I'll talk very briefly about the Philippines insurrection. We'll talk then about the Panama Canal, banana republics, and the annexation of Hawaii. So there will be 4 examples of American imperialism, and all of them point out to one conclusion. Americans are bad imperialists, and this means that we will return to isolation. That is the real outcome that I want you guys to get out of this. Americans are going to return to isolationism. So Americans are bad imperialists. Strong note here. American imperialism is in many ways an outgrowth of Western migration. In other words, we've been expansionist in American history. We've been expansionist all the way going back to 1607 with the foundation of the Jamestown settlement in Virginia. We talked about this in Western migration. We talked about manifest destiny, that America should own all of what will now be the United States, especially the lower 48, from coast to coast and from Canada to Mexico. But then, as we know, the frontier closed in 1890, according to Frederick Jackson Turner. But there was a strong impetus in American mysticism, the feeling in America that we need to grow outside of our borders with our ideas and ideals. Please write that down. Americans wanted to expand outside of our borders with our ideas and ideals. An ideal like a written constitution and a strong adherence to a very firm, clear written constitution. An ideal would be something like an independent judiciary that's fair and equitable to all people. Equality before the law. That's idealistic. Most countries, even today, their judiciary is very politically motivated. Only very few countries have a judiciary that's not politically motivated. So these are ideas and ideals, and we feel like since they work so well for us, Americans, that we want to try and do it for everyone. So with that in mind, let's start with our very first step. Our first step will be the annexation of Hawaii, which happened in 1893. But I'll talk about that kind of last as an example of how we're bad imperialists. So for a few minutes here, let's talk about what the United States got out of the Spanish-American War, and that is empire. And then I'll talk about how we got it. What the United States got out of the Spanish-American War, 1898, was empire. The map shows, especially, we'll start along the kind of the right-hand border. We've got Cuba, of which Guantanamo Bay, which you may have heard of, that's part of Cuba, obviously. And we will never give that up. And this is when we got Guantanamo Bay. It says the U.S. acquires exclusive rights to lease a naval base, 1898, and that's going to be Guantanamo Bay. We'll also get control over Puerto Rico, which we still have today as a territory and a protectorate. Moving towards the left, we're going to get a great deal of influence in the Central American countries, and that'll be banana republics, and we'll talk about that later. More importantly, at the time, we got control of all those islands leading out to the Philippines. And these are going to be used as coaling stations, C-O-A-L-I-N-G, coaling stations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this will be important later on, so take a little bit of a note here. Americans, especially technologically, are going to start switching to steam-powered merchant ships. And the way to get steam built up, the fuel that you're going to use is coal, C-O-A-L. And coal is a very bulky, very inefficient fuel. But we haven't really developed oil-fired steam engines yet. That's on the drawing boards, but it's not really been developed yet. So if you had enough coal on board your merchant ship to get all the way from the U.S. to China, then you would not in turn have enough room for cargo, a usable cargo. So what all the shipping companies did after the Spanish-American War is we captured all these islands or got control of them, and we turned those into coaling stations. In other words, these shipping companies would send ships out to those islands with nothing but coal on board. And then they would dump off all this coal on these various islands. Then that would be like a gas station, like a fuel stop for merchant ships coming from the United States to China. So one of the things the United States got out of the Spanish-American War is empire, which is control of all these islands, which in turn, strong note, gave us a great deal of influence in Southeast Asia and especially in China. So later on, Americans will be involved in the Boxer Rebellion, and that is sort of a part of American imperialism. But since it didn't lead anywhere, in other words, we drew back very, very quickly from that in 1900, it's really not a part of American imperialism. In other words, our government saw which way this thing was going, and it was driving us crazy. So we didn't push our advantage in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. So what the United States got out of the Spanish-American War is empire. Now let me go over how we got it. We will start with the destruction of the battleship Maine. Probably the most important step towards American imperialism is going to be the Spanish-American War. And it begins with what is known as gunboat diplomacy. And I will talk about that on several occasions, gunboat diplomacy. Now, as you all know, what I'm referring to is really what Alfred Thayer Mahan had talked about. In order to be important, you have to have a big giant navy. So Grover Cleveland and others had begun to build a big giant navy. And one of the products of that is going to be the USS Maine, a very early type of battleship. Well, the story goes that Spain was maltreating the people of Cuba. To be clear, Cuba had been a colony of Spain going back well into the 1500s, 1520s. And so here we are, 1898, and the president becomes aware, McKinley becomes aware, that the Spanish governor of Cuba is maltreating the people. So we sent the USS Maine down there just on, a little bit of diplomacy, gunboat diplomacy. In theory, the cover story is these are goodwill missions. You do a little maneuver called showing the flag. And that is to say our ship goes in there. They're invited in. The sailor's going to go on leave. They're going to, take in the sights, do a little wine, women, and song, have a good time. And it's just all about goodwill. But the real message is America is watching. That's the real message to Spanish-controlled Cuba. The Spanish governor of Cuba was being told in no uncertain terms, really, that the United States is paying attention to what's going on in Cuba. Well, so there in the lower right is the USS Maine actually entering Havana Harbor in January 1898. She's there for a few days, and unexpectedly, she blew up. Well, that leads to, and this is what I want you guys to make sure you put in your notes, gunboat diplomacy, Maine blows up, leads to yellow journalism. Yellow journalism. So taking a look at the newspaper, and this is William Randolph Hearst, some of the other newspapers in New York, they're going for the headlines, yellow journalism. It comes from a cartoon called The Yellow Kid. I don't know, look it up. And the idea here is that they're just going to a subscription war. They're going to sell newspapers. And so over time, yellow journalism takes on a new meaning. It's all about hyperbole, overstatement, misleading statements. It's newspaper. It's not really journalism. It's newspaper reporting that's designed to generate interest and then generate sales. And that's what's going on here. So take a look at this newspaper here. $50,000 reward, $50,000 reward, $50,000 reward, $50,000 reward, $50,000 reward, $50,000 reward. And it says that again and again and again and again and again. Listen, in 1898, $50,000 was a lot of money. And so the question that it's posing there is, who destroyed the battleship Maine? And the premise then is that this warship, the USS Maine, and it says there in the big gigantic headlines, was the work of an enemy. And Assistant Secretary Roosevelt, that's Theodore Roosevelt, is convinced that the explosion was not an accident. And so the newspaper, the New York Journal, is offering a vast treasure of money to find out who destroyed the battleship Maine. So for those of you guys who are interested in this, the U.S. Navy actually reopened the investigation to the USS Maine's destruction just a few years ago. So after over 100 years, this is still being investigated. So what almost certainly happened was there was a coal fire in the coal storage containers on the ship. Those are called bunkers. And coal, for those of you guys who don't know, under the right circumstances, can spontaneously combust. It can catch itself on fire. So you load the coal from the top, and then it feeds from the bottom into the engine room. And as this is being fed into the engines, a pocket emerges at the top level above the upper level of the coal. Well, coal dust is more explosive than dynamite. So imagine, if you will, an undetected coal fire has ignited inside the coal bunker on board the ship. The fire works its way up, goes into the air, this air and coal dust mixture, and blew up. Well, the ship itself is loaded full of gunpowder and cordite for all the cannons. And so all that detonated as well. Now let's use a little bit of image analysis. If you look in the upper right, you'll see a picture of the Maine, that big curve shape. You can see it in the photograph of the Maine down below. Those are the cranes that lift the boats that are on board the ship like lifeboats into the water. You can see that mast in the background, sort of, in that picture in the upper right. And you can see those same masts in the lower right in that picture. Compare that then, if you will, to the illustration in the newspaper. So the sunken Maine is resting on the bottom, and you can see that there was not much water below the ship. It blew up and it went straight to the bottom, and that much is still showing above the water. But take a look at the picture in the newspaper. If the newspaper was accurate, when the Maine blew up, it would sink completely out of sight. Furthermore, you can see floating below the Maine, in this illustration, a mine, and that's what the illustration suggests. That's what the caption suggests. Ladies and gentlemen, if that mine was real to scale, it'd be the size of a city bus, a giant school bus. So imagine, if you will, the sailors of this ship are like hanging around in the harbor, and the Spanish come along and they float this big giant mine underneath the ship, and the sailors are like complacent about this whole thing, and then it blows up and kills them. Well, that's just ridiculous. So gunboat diplomacy leads to the Maine going into Havana Harbor to signal to the Spanish that we are watching. The Maine blew up almost certainly because of an accident. But then yellow journalism takes over and blows the whole thing way, way out of proportion. Strong note here, that leads to war fever. War fever. Yellow journalism then leads to war fever. Everybody wanted a war. Now, please bear in mind that the last major conflict that we'd had was the Civil War 30 years before. And so imagine, if you will, you're a kid and you grow up with these stories of, heroism, daring do from your grandpa about how he did all kinds of crazy stuff during the Civil War. Furthermore, you've heard about all these adventures out there on the Western prairies. The U.S. Army out there chasing these Native Americans. And so you want a piece of the action. Along comes a war that you can really sink your teeth into. Strong note. The Spanish were presented with this idea that the United States was about to go to war with Spain over the destruction of the battleship Maine. And the Spanish tried desperately to stop this from happening. They kept saying, listen, we didn't have anything to do with it, which is true. Finally, strong note now, the Spanish offered to pay for the battleship in order to avoid this terrible, terrible conflict. But war fever was really driving the narrative in America. So let's go to the next slide and take a look, if I could just say it, at a little bit of image analysis. You guys know how I feel about that. So here's some image analysis that will show you just how war fever was really driving this. Take a look at the big illustration there on the right side of the slide. Now, this is McKinley being a really, really smart politician. When I was doing some research for this, I found this out, and I was like, wow, this is, I wrote a paper on it, got an A. McKinley has to nationalize the National Guard, the state militias. They have to get called up, and then they're going to be sent off to fight this war. Because the U.S. Army is out west fighting Native Americans. I have a picture on that later on. And so when these state National Guards are militarized and nationalized, what McKinley did, and you don't have to write a note on this, but it is very interesting. He would find out if the commanding officer had been an old Union guy. And then he'll say, okay, well, I'm going to make the second in command an old Confederate guy. And vice versa. If the commanding officer was an old Confederate guy, he's going to make the second in command an old Union guy. And so you see in this picture a Confederate and a Union guy coming together, shaking hands to liberate Cuba, this little girl in the background. Now, you can see that she has a little tiara on, a little crown that says Cuba on it, and there's the Cuban flag kind of right above her in the background. And there are her chains being released. I don't know. If you ask me, I don't think any Cuban girl that ever was born looked like that. Blonde, curly hair, and clear complexion like that. But that's how we're portraying it. America is going to come together as a team in the presence of a foreign enemy. That's what's important here. America is coming together as a team in the presence of a foreign enemy. And so this will help to reconcile the United States against in the aftermath of the Civil War, because we're coming together to go fight the Spanish. In the upper left, you see an image that's like really, really, this is just jingoistic. It's very, very racist in a way. And so here's Uncle Sam with, the American eagle on his shoulder. He's smoking a big, giant cigar. And here are evidently the various people of Cuba. And some of them are of European ancestry, and others of Native American ancestry, and some of them are of mixed ancestry and African ancestry. But we Americans, wow, we got to come together to liberate all those people of Cuba, which is actually not what was going to happen. Down below, you see some pin back buttons. In other words, they'll have a sort of a pin. You can put these on your lapel. And so the United States, because of this war fever, is going to generate a huge amount of kitsch, of illustrations, of just, pottery and coffee cups and just all kinds of stuff saying, remember the Maine. One of those images down there is, we're going to remember the Maine. By gosh and by darn, by golly, we're going to do that. There's Uncle Sam punching some Spanish guy right in the face. Cuba or bust, by gosh. Remember the Maine. It's all very innocent. But at the same time, it's generating war fever. And so, strong note here, McKinley, who really didn't want the war to begin with, has to respond to the will of the American people. Please make sure you make a note of that. McKinley must respond to the will of the American people. And so he makes a political calculation, which is unfortunate. McKinley will recognize that if he can be the president during a victorious conflict, he will be reelected, which is exactly what happened. McKinley's going to be reelected in part because of the Spanish-American War. And that's not the best way to get reelected. But it's war fever that sweeps the nation, and so he has to say, okay, you're going to get your war. So with that in mind, let's go and talk about the actual conduct of the war. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, much more on analysis than on actual combat operations. So let's take a look at the Spanish-American War very briefly. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me start with the idea that the Navy does great. The Navy really does do an excellent job. Admiral Schley, you can see his label up there on some of those light blue lines. Admiral Sampson, they're going to go out there and put a big giant blockade around Cuba. No ships in, no ships out. At the last moment, a Spanish admiral coming from Spain, Admiral Cervera, he's going to arrive, and this will be important later on. He's going to put the Spanish fleet is going to go into Santiago de Cuba, a big giant harbor there. Well, so Cervera arrives from Spain, goes into Santiago, and is blockaded. No ships in, no ships out. Now, the Navy did a great job, but I'm sorry to tell you this, the Army did not do so well. The Army did not do very well. Our Army was really out west chasing Native Americans. And so the regular Army did not do a whole lot here. So what we're talking about is an activated National Guard, which nobody had been taking very seriously at all since the Civil War. Furthermore, and this is important, none of our people, whether they're regular Army or volunteers or National Guard units, none of them had any meaningful jungle training. And Cuba is a tropical island. No one had any jungle training. Furthermore, I have to say, our Army was really, really badly equipped. Our military was going through a change from sort of old-fashioned muskets and single-shot rifles to multiple-shot bolt-action rifles. I know that sounds technical, but what I'm driving at is that our Army got a real loser of a rifle. By contrast, the people of Cuba, they were not interested in being invaded from America and told how to run their country from America. In other words, the situation in Cuba was bad, but it was very much overstated in our own press. So the people of Cuba will, in fact, rise up in their own defense against America. Again, this is technical. As it turns out, their guys had a really good rifle called a Mauser. They got it from the Germans. And you know the Germans make good stuff. The Mauser 98K was going to be the standard German rifle all the way through World War I and through World War II. And they'd sold a bunch of these to the Cubans, to the Spanish, who gave it to the Cubans. And so they have a really good rifle, and we got a really crappy one. But the hallmark of the American soldier, as many historians have said, is that, you give those guys a piece of broken glass and a rock and tell them to go take a hill, and they will take it. They're going to find a way. So while the Army is undertrained and poorly equipped, they're going to do the best they can. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about this just a little bit more. So the capture of the Spanish fleet and Santiago is the goal. Our guys land. Probably one of the most important events is the charge up the San Juan Hill. Just a little bit of a note on this. Again, you can see from the map here, they're going to have to bust a bunch of jungle, and our guys didn't know how to do that. They get on the other side, and they have to go up some hills to take the Spanish position. Our guys are getting shot to pieces. and they just assault. They just, they didn't know how badly they had it, so they simply went over to the attack. And it turns out that this was successful. We had a lot of casualties, but it was successful. An interesting fact about this, however, is the charge up the San Juan Hill was all done on foot. So this was a critical element of it. We charged up San Juan Hill, mostly Kettle Hill, as it turns out, defeated the local Spanish forces, and our guys were heading towards Santiago to capture the Spanish fleet from the landward side. Now, very briefly, one other set of images that I want to take a look at. Let's take a look at what Teddy Roosevelt is up to. So Teddy Roosevelt kind of steals the show. He'd been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. You saw that in that earlier newspaper. And he immediately resigned his job there and decided that he was going to raise a unit of cavalry. And they're going to be called the Rough Riders, the first American volunteer cavalry. And their nickname was the Rough Riders. So in typical Teddy Roosevelt fashion, he paid for everything. Uniforms, equipment, saddles, horses, he paid for it all. And then he recruited a retired Army general, General Leonard Wood, to be the commander of this unit that he had paid for. And he said, I'll be the second in command, because I don't know anything about how to train an Army unit. He was never in the military. So he got this retired general to train the unit, and he would be the second in command. Well, of course, he's going to, in terms of publications, in terms of propaganda, he's going to steal the show. Here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. We did not have enough shipping to send their horses. Sending horses by sea requires a specialized ship. You can't just have some ship with an open hold and put a bunch of horses in there and expect it to work. It won't. Horses get seasick, but they can't throw up. They can't vomit. So they simply die. And so we only had enough specialized shipping for the horses necessary to pull the artillery and the supply wagons. So here are the Rough Riders, who were recruited in San Antonio, Texas. All these guys are basically from Texas and New Mexico. Some from Oklahoma and a few from Louisiana, but most of these guys are from Texas. Well, they had to leave their horses behind, and as you can see in these two photographs at the top, there's not a horse in sight. These guys had to actually go into action on foot. Well, is Teddy Roosevelt, the question is Teddy Roosevelt doing all this with the thought of his own political future? Well, perhaps. But a better argument is probably that Teddy Roosevelt, he's just a man of action. He only wanted to be where the action is at. Now, will he use this later on? Well, as it turns out, he does. And this makes him very popular in the eyes of the American people. But let's conclude the fighting with a view of what the Navy's up to. Now, Cervera saw that his Navy was about to be captured, his fleet was about to be captured by the American Army, and he said, no, I'm not going to do that. So, quite by surprise on our side, Cervera, the Spanish admiral, told all of his guys to get their engines going and get the steam up, and they charged out. And they ran into Admiral Schley, that's who you see down there in the lower left, and that big giant fleet of ships that you see right there in the center of the image. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't know how else to put this except to tell you the blunt truth. The Spanish fleet ran right into a firing squad. That's exactly what happened. Our guys were caught by surprise, but the surprise lasted like 30 seconds. And then they just said, I'll just shoot them as they're coming out of the harbor. And we blew them to pieces. And so here's a Spanish fleet that's way undermanned and obsolete and poorly trained, and they run in front of all those ships. At the same time, ladies and gentlemen, on the other side of the world is Admiral George Dewey. And Dewey is on China Station. He's in Chinese waters. And he got a telegram saying, hey, by the way, we are at war with Spain. So leave Chinese waters, go to the Philippines, and blow the crap out of their Navy, the Spanish Navy in the Philippines. And so Admiral Dewey, with a fleet that you see down there at the bottom, he's going to leave China, head for the Philippines. There is the Spanish fleet tied up at the harbor. They're not even ready to fight. And he simply sails in and blows the crap out of them. So we have one big giant fleet in the Atlantic and another big giant fleet in the Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, listen to me very carefully here. I want you guys to think. All I ever want you guys to do in class is think. What you're seeing in these two pictures is the end result of what Alfred Thayer Mahan had said, grow a big giant navy. But what I want you guys to be thinking about is what it took to build all of these ships. Notice that though they have masts, these are for flag signals and for radio transmission, which is brand new at the time. They're not for sails, is what I'm driving at. And so, think how many engineers it took to design these ships. Bear in mind that you can't take a design engineer and take him off of building merchant ships or these big giant passenger liners and say, okay, build a battleship. It doesn't work like that. You have to have specialized people to do that. Then the Navy has to approve the designs. And then any new scientific developments have to go into the design. Then you have to have specialized shipyards to build these big giant battleships. Think of how much steel went into them. Think of the big giant guns and the technology necessary to build those. Then you have to train the engineers. You have to train the sailors. You have to train the admirals and the captains and the navigators. And you have to train them and train them and train them. Then all of those people have to be administered. You know, they transfer between ships. The ships have to be manned. The sailors have to be paid. And so think how big our government got because the people, having become aware of what Alfred Thayer Mahan was saying in his book, decided that we, the United States, needed to have a big, gigantic fleet. The Navy became enormous. The government of the United States became huge. Now, collectively, this is referred to as the Great White Fleet. It's not because it's racist at all. They were racist, but that's not what was called the Great White Fleet. The Navy concluded that the color that we were going to paint our fleet was going to be white. Usually a sort of a tan color on top and then a white color for the hull. Different fleets had different colors. For the Russians, for example, they insisted on painting the hulls of all their ships black. Many other navies said there was going to be, the Spanish Navy, for example, was going to be red. And so, but we chose white as our color to indicate that, you know, on the high seas, you could tell an American ship. And so it was referred to as the Great White Fleet. So our Navy did really well, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So with that in mind, let's continue to take a look at what's going on with the Spanish-American War. So very briefly, this is the Battle of Manila, the 1st of May, 1898. Again, this is Admiral Dewey. He's out there blowing up the Spanish fleet. And you can see that in the newspaper there. Dewey smashes Spain's fleet. That happens to be a London newspaper. The image that you see in the background, this very lurid image, you know, again, we've seen this before in paintings. There's a light side and a dark side. And you see the Navy, the U.S. Navy, with those gray ships. They'd been painted gray for the war, with all the flags snapping in the breeze and the smoke is going. And on the other side, the Spanish Navy is just being blown to pieces, which is exactly what happened. Now, in the very foreground, there's about to be a shipwreck because one ship is heading directly towards another, but that's a separate issue. So we just see all these pictures of our Navy going out there and just blowing the crap out of the enemy, which is exactly what happened. The legacy of the Spanish-American War, very briefly on this. Let me start with a rather obscure individual, Arthur MacArthur, and that's his picture right there. When the war was over, Arthur MacArthur, who was an Army general, a colonel in the Army, I guess I should say, was stationed in the Philippines. And he was part of the Philippines occupation force. And he stayed there for many, many years. He and his wife had a child there named Douglas MacArthur. There's Douglas MacArthur's picture down below. And so Douglas MacArthur, from a very early age, had a connection with the Pacific Ocean and operations that go on there. And that will serve us well later on in World War II. He knows all about how to operate and what's going on in the Pacific. He has a very close relationship with the people of the Philippines from a very young age. The picture that you see there is him in his West Point graduation uniform. So there is a legacy. In other words, Douglas MacArthur, born and basically raised in the Philippines because his father was stationed there, is going to be important in World War II. Very quickly here in the lower right, you can see, and I have that blue arrow pointing right at him, is Lieutenant Pershing. He's commanding some Indian scouts out there on the plains. And that happens to be 1891, just a few years before the Spanish-American War. So what I want to do with this image is reinforce the idea that our regular army, of which John J. Pershing was part, was out in the West chasing Native Americans. You can see they're still wearing the old blue coat left over from the Civil War, which had been 30 years before. But part of the legacy is going to be the modernization of the Army. Please write that down. One of the legacies of the Spanish-American War will be our Army is going to get modernized. And so that picture in the upper right is Black Jack Pershing later on during World War I. And he's wearing a much more modernized uniform in the sort of a field drab color. And he's a modern officer, and everything's been, very much modernized. The American Army is going to see their mistakes and their errors, and we're going to get, pulled out of the West, and we're going to get modernized into a modern fighting force. And that will be a legacy of the Spanish-American War. So the results, very briefly. Spain, a weak European power, is ousted from Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Central America, et al. Et al. Is a good Roman phrase. I've said it before, and others. 10 weeks of fighting gives the United States a vast overseas empire. The war ends December 10th, 1898. It really began, the fighting really began in March. So, but the treaty is not till December 10th, 1898. The next note I do want you to write a little bit of a bullet point on. We had promised, now listen, our idea here is that we're bad imperialists. And this is sort of a piece of evidence on that. We had hinted to the people of the Philippines that they were going to get their independence because of the defeat of Spain. The Philippines had been a Spanish colony going back to the mid-1500s. And we strongly hinted to the Philippine people that we were going to give them their liberty. We're going to give them their independence. Instead, strong note, we replaced one imperial power, Spain, with ourselves. And so the people of the Philippines, they rebelled. They didn't like that. And this is called the Philippines Insurrection. And it's actually much more deadly to our soldiers and much more dangerous to us and lasted longer than the Spanish-American War itself. It lasted several years, and before we finally got the Philippines under control from having promised them independence, and they yanked it back at the last minute. The next bullet point, the way is clear to build the Panama Canal. We will talk about that shortly. The U.S. greatly influences Central American nations. These are called banana republics. We will talk about that shortly. The U.S. gains coaling stations across the Pacific. That's already in your notes. The U.S. industry and government builds a bigger military. That also is in your notes already. We just got done talking about that. The Navy is going to continue on to modernize and improve, and the Army in particular is going to modernize and improve. The bullet point I really want you guys to take a strong note on is the very next one. The United States is going to achieve great power status. Up to the Spanish-American War, the United States has always been viewed by the Europeans as a third-rate power on our very best day. For example, during the Civil War, we had the largest military on planet Earth by far. But the Europeans did not take the United States seriously even then with the largest army in the world, because they said, well, it's only going on because of this Civil War in America. And sure enough, once the war was over with, the army basically disappeared. And the Europeans could not see any way clear to make out that the U.S. was a serious military power when our regular army was out west chasing Native Americans. They just couldn't be taken, the United States couldn't be taken seriously. For the Spanish-American War 1898, we achieved great power status. Strong note, it's not on here, you have to write this down. To achieve great power status, which is a good old boys club, mostly made up of the Europeans and the United States now, but later on, Japan will be a part of this too because they're going to beat the Russians. But that will be later. To achieve great power status, you have to do one of two things, and that is defeat another great power. Militarily defeat another great power, and that was Spain, and we did that. Or have overseas colonies, and we took over Spain's colonies. So we also had that. So from being a third-rate power, we became a first-rate power. We were part of this good old boys club called great power status. Last but not least, the American public is reconciled with the Civil War. Again, I pointed that out. McKinley is going to assign officers so that Southern officers and Northern officers were working together against a common enemy, Spain. I will say that part again. Our Army, especially their commanding officers, are working together as a team against a common enemy, in this case, Spain. And so the people really feel reconciled about the Civil War. Now, that's not to say that the South learned anything from the Civil War. They did not. But that's political and sociological. Militarily, the Spanish-American War serves to reconcile the public with the Civil War. So with that in mind, let's talk about another example of America being bad imperialist. Our first example is the Spanish-American War. We're bad imperialists. We treated the Philippines bad. We beat the crap out of Spain, who had they did not have a dog in this fight. And we just whaled the crap out of them. And then we took over their colony, just muscled them out of the way and took over their colonies. And so that's us being bad neighbors. It's us being, really sort of difficult to live with. So let's go to our first example, our second example, and that is the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal, strong note. So the United States recognized the need for the Panama Canal. This was a military need. We'd had ships in the Pacific that we needed in the Atlantic during the Spanish-American War. Similarly, we could see that there was going to be a need for ships that were in the Atlantic to be in the Pacific. And without the Panama Canal, as you can all imagine, the only way to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific was to go all the way around South America. During the war, the USS Oregon actually did that. She started out in San Diego. We knew diplomatically that none of the Central and South American nations would help, allow them to coal up in any one of their ports. So the USS Oregon had to take all the coal necessary to sail all the way down the coast of South America and then all the way back up the Atlantic. Reports have them having stacked sacks of coals in the hallways, in the gangways on the ship, big giant heaps of coal up on the decks. Furthermore, by the time the USS Oregon got to America, got to the United States on the Atlantic side, her engines were worn out, the ship itself was exhausted, the men were exhausted, and by the time she got ready to go into the fight, the war was already over with. So America sees the need for the Panama Canal. Strong note here. Panama at that time was a state within the nation of Colombia. Write that down in big giant letters. Panama was at that time a state within the nation of Panama. I'm sorry, within the nation of Colombia. So we went to Colombia. The United States went to Colombia, and we said, listen, we want to put this canal in. And the Colombians said no, because they were afraid the United States had a territorial interest, which we did. The United States wants the canal. We go to the Colombians and say we want to put the canal in. The Colombians say no. We offered them a lot of money, $20 million, to put the canal in. And the Colombians said no because they knew that we had a territorial interest. At about the same time, the French and the British, for reasons of their own, wanted to put the canal in. And Colombia said yes to them. Colombia said yes to the French and the British, because they knew that the French and the British did not have a territorial interest. So, strong note now, the British will do the financing. They were going to raise all the money, sell a bunch of stocks. They were going to raise all the money, do all the financing. The French would do all the engineering. The French were, as we have seen in other cases, the French were technologically the most elite country in the world at the time. So the French did all the planning. They worked it all out. They said, listen, instead of building a canal all the way across, which would be virtually impossible, one of the fastest ways to create a canal is to simply create a series of dams. Dam up a bunch of valleys. Panama is tropical in nature, and there's a lot of rainforest down in that area. So simply wait for rainwater to fill up these big giant lakes, and you got yourself an automatic canal, which is exactly what they did. Then the area where you actually have to build a canal is very, very short indeed. Part of it that you see in that picture in the bottom is called the Calabria Cut. And so they did have to move a mountain. Well, there was a new development called dynamite. That was actually a new invention. It was invented by a Norwegian guy named Alfred Nobel, as in the Nobel Peace Prize. Nobel was an engineer. So he developed dynamite. Another company called DuPont, among many others, started manufacturing dynamite in huge amounts. And then the steam shovel, another development of the era, made it possible to literally cut a big giant valley through this mountain. So the locks, the mechanism to raise the water, the dams necessary to make the lake, the routes that were all done up, the French did every bit of that. Continue on with strong notes. Britain started running into financial problems. They had a short, sharp depression, a panic. We've seen these before. The French also ran into a very serious problem. Their engineers and workers started dying in huge numbers. They got beriberi, yellow fever, malaria. You know, working in that area, it's a tropical rainforest, as I've said. It's not like working in France. And so they started losing engineers and workers by the thousands. And so the French began to lose interest in the Panama Canal. Let's go on to the next slide and figure out what happens next. So, Roosevelt sees his chance. And he says, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take over the failed French effort. We'll also take over the British effort. Roosevelt was excellent at this. He sold the idea to the American people that we need to put the canal through. And you can kind of see that in the cartoon up at the top. There's Roosevelt with millions for the canal. We're shoving Columbia out of the way. You can see Uncle Sam in the background with a shovel in his hand, and we're ready to get this started. The people of the United States of America were very, very enthusiastic about this. We wanted to show our own ability to grow and to do all these big, giant construction projects, succeed where other people had failed. So, foment rebellion in Panama. Foment means to begin or to instigate. What we did, ladies and gentlemen, was told the people of Panama that if you will rebel against Colombia, we will instantly recognize your independence. Then we'll put in the canal, and you guys will get rich. So the people of Panama, a state within the nation of Colombia, they kind of said, well, okay, we will do that. And bang, we instantly recognized their independence. And then told Colombia, listen, if you want your state back, you got to come through us. You got to fight America. So we just shoved the Colombians out of the way. We took over all the plans from the French. We bought all of the equipment, the locks, and the pumping material that was going to go into the canal. As it turns out, a lot of the locks and pumping material are still the same stuff that the French had built all the way back at the turn of the last century. They did good work. That stuff is still there. Not all of it, but there's still enough French equipment there that you can see it. And so we put in a canal. An interesting side note, you'd have to write a note on this, but it's kind of interesting. Roosevelt is actually going to be the first president in the history of the United States up to that time to actually leave the United States while he is the president. No one else had done that. And he goes to Panama. The story goes that he woke up early one day. There's actually a picture of this. I probably should have included it. But he woke up early one day, went down to the construction site, and got one of the steam shovel operators to teach him how to run the steam shovel. Well, breakfast came along, and everybody said, well, where's the president? Where's the president? Well, he's already down at the work site. And so a couple of photographers ran down there real quick, and sure enough, they caught a picture of Roosevelt running one of these steam shovels. Now, you can say that this is some kind of propaganda, but the better interpretation is he just wants to identify with the common man. He wants to get his hands dirty. On the other hand, when Americans saw him actually physically building the canal, they loved it. One other sidebar, this is new to history. I don't even think it's in your textbook. But the way that we overcame the problem of disease that the French had found so debilitating, we recruited workers from throughout the Caribbean. This is new to history. We only just rediscovered this. And we go through the Caribbean, and we say to all the Caribbeans who are of African descent, listen, we have really great, lucrative jobs. They're going to pay really well building this canal. And so come and work for us, and we'll pay you really well. So many Caribbeans got involved in this. And the idea was that they were going to be more attuned to the ecology and to the conditions there, and malaria and yellow fever and beriberi will not affect them so badly. That's not true. Malaria is spread through mosquitoes, and they are equal opportunity offenders. Furthermore, when it was all over with, we maltreated all these Caribbean islanders and did not pay them what we said we were going to pay them, and the conditions were actually horrible, but they built the canal, and they got exactly no credit for it. Our engineers, we sent them down there for a very short period of time, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, while they were just getting out of engineering school, and then they could get a feel for a big giant project and running a big huge project and be able to put that on their resume. But then we switched them out with other engineers, young engineers who were just starting out. And so they didn't have time to, well, I don't know, get killed. So what comes out of that dynamic is we have a whole lot of engineers that have experience on huge projects, and that helps us. So build the canal. That's the next bullet point then, is think international policy. So the way Roosevelt is going to do this, in other words, we were seen internationally as the bad guys here. The cartoon is contemporary up there at the top. And so is the cartoon there at the bottom, the color cartoon. And everybody knows that we're kind of being the bad guy. Roosevelt had very famously said, speak softly and carry a big stick. And everybody made a big joke out of that. So there's Roosevelt with his mouth closed, but he's got this big, gigantic billy club. And all over the world, they're coming to America, who's now emerging as this big, giant power. And it's the new diplomacy. It's the world's policeman. And there are the British. And you see on the kind of the right side of the slide, there's some very jingoistic, very racist kind of points of view. There's the Japanese. They've got a sword in their hand. The Chinese with their Chinese, unique Chinese clothing. There, the guy in the red coat in the foreground, that's the British. But then you see all these Central and South American countries, and they're also being portrayed in these white cotton clothes, and they need a haircut, and they got a beard, and they all got sombreros on. And that's not the way people dressed. It's very jingoistic. It's a joke. It's making fun of all these people. But the way Roosevelt fixed it, everybody knew that we were being bad neighbors. The way he fixed it was, he said, listen, we built the canal, we put it through. So anybody can use it. You just have to pay a small maintenance fee. Please write that down. We had a bad image because of the canal. And Roosevelt made it good by saying anybody can use the canal. They just have to pay a small maintenance fee. And then all over the world, they were like, wow, you Americans are really great. Wow, woohoo, hooray for America. Look what you guys did. You put this canal in, and then you didn't charge anybody any money for it. That's amazing. Which is true, but we had to stiff Colombia for it. Now, we did have a guilty conscience. In 1922, when our economy was absolutely booming and going nuts, we're going to give Colombia $25 million. We had promised them, I think, $20 or $21 million. Check your textbook, to put the canal in the first place, and Colombia denied that. But then we went back and said, listen, we actually treated you guys badly. And so we're going to give them $25 million, $1922, which was a lot of money. So what I want you guys to get out of this is we did build the canal, and we did an amazing job at it, and everybody thought so, except for the Colombians. But we are being bad neighbors. This is bad imperialism. And America emerging as the world's policeman, which is the caption of that color cartoon, the world's constable. That's not what Americans really want. We don't want to be the cops of planet Earth. We've never wanted that. And yet that's the way it's like starting to emerge. So with that in mind, let's take another look at another example. So our first example of bad imperialism is the Spanish-American War. Our second one, the Panama Canal. Our next one, banana republics. So, banana republics. Again, TR, they're using that cartoon. Speak softly and carry a big stick. There's this big, giant, huge navy that's going around the Caribbean, beating the crap out of people. You can see, some of the Central American countries there, Santo Domingo and all these others, and there's banana trees everywhere. And there's TR with his military uniform and a great big giant stick. So here's what's going on. First note I want you guys to take. There are two technological developments that are important here. So there's a little bit of background. Number one is the development and widespread use of steam merchant ships. The development and widespread use of steam merchant ships. This means they've got a propeller. It's just like a steamship that you would think of today. So why is that important here? Well, the prevailing wind goes from east to west. Think of the direction that all those hurricanes come from. They start out there in the Atlantic, they come bowling through the Caribbean and right into Guatemala and the Yucatan and up into the Gulf of Mexico. So if you're a sailing ship and you're in Belize or Honduras or El Salvador, Guatemala, or any one of those countries, the chances that you can get, they can sail straight into the teeth of the wind is almost zero. The second technological development is a railroad network in America. A railroad network is unified. Everything is one gauge, track gauge. Your book will talk about that. And it's all in good repair. We have new locomotives, and so it's very, very efficient. And that means you can start to take advantage of a fruit called the banana. Now, I'm morally convinced that all of you know what a banana is. I'm not trying to patronize you or dumb this down, but think of a banana. Everybody loves them. If you don't like, banana bread, you're not even an American in my view. That's like the best thing ever. But as you all know, bananas have a very short shelf life. So when they're ripe, that is to say still on the tree, as many of you know, they're still kind of green. But then you put them onto a steamship, and they're only maybe 2-3 days travel away from the United States. Maybe 4 or 5 days travel from New York or Boston. But you can go to one of the southern ports, New Orleans, or Mobile, Alabama, or Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia, get the fruit off of the ships, I'll have a picture of that in a minute, onto the railroads, and then anybody in America can be eating a banana. So the demand curve is unlimited. Please write that down. The demand curve for bananas becomes unlimited. And this presents an opportunity. Now we're talking here not about the United States. We're talking about United States private industries, especially the United Fruit Company, Dole, and Chiquita. Dole and Chiquita, that's all they do today is bananas. United Fruit Company, Dole, and Chiquita. They see an opportunity. So the exploitation and internal politics of the people of Central American nations. So, strong note now, don't get lost. These corporations are going to go to Central America, where bananas are grown. That's their major export crop today. And they'll say, only grow bananas. Create a monocrop agriculture. Only grow bananas. Develop a monocrop agriculture. And so, Honduras, Nicaragua, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica, they will do that. In exchange, these fruit companies, Dole, Chiquita, and the United Fruit Company will say, listen, we will take from America inexpensive, high-quality food products and give to you. You give us bananas, and we'll give you beef and pork and chicken and lettuce and all these other vegetables, carrots and potatoes and everything else that you guys don't have. We'll give you the good stuff, and you give us bananas in return. Continue on with really strong notes here. This is what a banana republic is really all about. Once these farmers were trapped in that deal, that a monocrop agriculture in return for our stuff, these fruit companies, the United Fruit Company, Dole and Chiquita, dialed back what they were giving for bananas. Whereas before they said, listen, you gave us this beautiful crop of bananas, we'll give you a dozen cows and a whole bunch of pigs and a whole bunch of this and a whole bunch of that. Now, the same farmer will give the same amount of fruit, bananas, and will say, listen, we're going to give you a couple of heads of lettuce and maybe a little cabbage thrown in, and that's all you're going to get. We'll begin to shortchange these farmers in Central America. They are giving up valuable fruits that are in high demand in America, and we're not giving them really anything in return. Continue on with super strong notes here. This is what makes a banana republic. The way these fruit companies are going to get away with it is corrupt the local governments. That is the key issue. We will corrupt their local governments. These corporations will go to the local governments and say, listen, we know we're treating your farmers really badly, but here's a bunch of money to look the other way. Don't pay attention to anything that we're doing. Take this money and let us screw your farmers over. And that is the recipe for a banana republic. That's what a banana republic means going forward. It starts out, obviously, with the actual fruit bananas. But today, there are a lot of banana republics because we're exploiting the workers and corrupting their governments. And that's the recipe for a banana republic. Yes? So these things still exist today. Now, again, this is imperialism, and it's not, don't get confused here, this is not cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism is a little bit different. As many of you know, I've traveled all over the world. I've been to China, Central America, I've been to Asia, all throughout Asia and Europe, parts of, the Middle East. And I tell you plainly, you can go to any one of these countries and get a Coca-Cola. Not a cola. Many of these countries have their own type of cola, but a Coca-Cola. Or you see people wearing blue jeans. Totally an American development. You can go eat Kentucky Fried Chicken anywhere. Moscow. I haven't been to Moscow to eat it, but I have been all over the rest of Europe. And in Prague, there is a Kentucky Fried Chicken. I've eaten there. In Beijing, I've eaten that Kentucky Fried Chicken in Beijing. Okay, so that's cultural imperialism. Americans make some product really, really famous, and then everybody wants it. But this is industrial imperialism. We're going into there, and we're exploiting these workers, and we're corrupting governments so that we can exploit workers and treat them really, really badly. And we're doing that today. But it starts here, and we call them banana republics, and the name is stuck. So there is one other part of this that I want to draw your attention to, and that's with the next slide. So here we are. Again, this is just a little bit of image analysis. I mentioned before that these steamships are going to be important, and there they are. You can especially see that all in one photograph in the lower right. A steamship is pulled up into the harbor. I think that's actually in Baltimore, but they're based on the railroad car there. But they're unloading it directly out of the hold of the ship and walking it right over to a railroad car, and then off it goes. There in New York Harbor, a bunch of African Americans are taking these bananas that have been brought up to, and they're brought up to the harbor, putting it onto refrigerator cars and shipping them all over. In that color image, in the foreground, the photographer was standing on a ship that was unloading bananas. You can see it right there in the middle of the picture, onto these wagons, which will go straight to the markets. So these are images of the industrial developments that made bananas possible. And the demand curve, again, is unlimited. One last issue with banana republics. As time goes on, these banana republics, the people will rebel. And this is critical. Please write this down. We're going to get involved in a few banana wars. And so there is our army in Nicaragua. And our army and navy will be the muscle for these private corporations. I will say that again. Our army and navy, the army and the Marine Corps, will be the muscle for the private corporations. The people of these countries, Nicaragua in particular, but Honduras, El Salvador as well, will get fed up with it. The people will get fed up. And they'll demand an end to this. And the governments there are corrupted, and they'll say, no, we're not going to end it. And so the people will start fighting. Well, the governments there, they can't call upon their people to end the rebellion. Their people are in rebellion. So they'll call on the Americans, and we'll go down there and kick the crap out of these people. We exploit them, and then we beat them on behalf of these huge corporations. And again, that's part of the recipe for a banana republic. So again, when we talk about banana republics, we're being bad neighbors, really bad neighbors. The last example that I have here is probably the most egregious. It happened first, but it's probably the most egregious, but it also happened the quickest. It was overnight, and hardly anybody recognized it unless you were right there on the scene. Strong note. In Hawaii, there was a development of two crops that we wanted really badly in America. Sugar, especially to feed West Coast markets, and a new product called pineapples, which everybody wanted. Pineapples are actually a sort of fruit that was from South America. It's a fruit that was native to the jungles of Central America, South America, especially the Amazon rainforest. But botanists had developed a little bit and did a little bit of selective breeding with it and put it into Hawaii, and it went crazy. In Hawaii, pineapple is actually an invasive crop. Sugar is also an invasive crop there. It is not native to Hawaii. But both of these crops are going to feed the West Coast. Strong note then. So throughout the 1880s and 1890s, a bunch of white people, plantation owners, had gone to Hawaii, bought up a bunch of land, put in these big giant plantations. Strong note now. Then they began to get involved in Hawaiian politics. They managed to get themselves elected. And they attempted an overthrow from within. White plantation owners, and actually Dole was part of this. They go to Hawaii, put in sugar plantations, put in pineapple plantations. They use cheap labor, ironically, from Japan. And then they get elected into the Hawaiian government, which was a democracy. It was a monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy. So Hawaii, strong note now, was an internationally recognized independent kingdom. Of all the states of the United States, only Hawaii had been an independent country before they became a state. So you know where I'm going with this? These white people get involved in their government, then stage an overthrow from within. They imprisoned the queen at the time, Liliuokalani, in a hotel room and basically held her hostage. And then, during this violent overthrow, they started shooting up a bunch of Hawaiians. And the queen kept saying, stop shooting my people. I'll do what you guys want. Just stop shooting my people. So these white plantation owners had gotten together and they said to her, listen, we want you to renounce being the queen of Hawaii and become a U.S. protectorate. And if you don't, and you people try to fight back, we have the U.S. Navy in the harbor waiting for trouble. And that's the USS Boston that you see down there in Hawaiian waters in 1895. She was there at the time as well. And so if the Hawaiians had fought back and tried to stop these white people from taking over, which should have been easy, the white people were way, way outnumbered by Hawaiians. Then these white guys said, listen, we'll just call the Navy in, we'll call the Marines in, and they'll stomp you. So through basically a violent overthrow, Hawaii became an American protectorate. It became an American territory. It won't actually become a United States until the late 1950s, 1959. I think in class I said 1955, but I looked it up, it's 1959. So Hawaii will be the last of the 50 United States. The reason why Hawaii couldn't become a state right away, and why I talked about it last, is because the status of Hawaii is going to be way up in the air. Everybody knew that this was bad and dirty dealing. Everybody knew it. So McKinley and Roosevelt and really Taft didn't want to touch it. On the other hand, Hawaii, their government had been overthrown and was really in the charge of these white guys and, Dole, the company Dole, and they kept saying, "Listen, you can't leave us not independent and yet not a kingdom either." And so finally, we took Hawaii on as a protectorate, as a territory. So that's why, although it happened first, I put it last in our list of bad things that are going on. Because it took forever for the United States to say, okay, we'll make Hawaii into a protectorate or a territory. But it was a violent overthrow. And then the United States government accepted that. And our Navy was involved one way or another. There's a Navy landing force right there. That's in Hawaii. So our guys were on the ground at the time. So our first example of bad imperialism was the Spanish-American War. We're being the bad guys here. Plain and simple. We have wonderful goals in mind, but we're being bad guys. Our second example is the Panama Canal. And again, we have wonderful goals in mind, ideas and ideals. We have wonderful ideas in mind, but we go about it in a very, very negative way. We maltreated Colombia in that particular case. Then banana republics. We're going to get involved with ideas and ideals, but then we maltreat the people there in a really bad way, and we have to back up what we're doing with the Army and the Navy. Those pictures are in Nicaragua. That's our guys in Nicaragua beating the crap out of the locals. Then, although it happened first, the situation clarified last, and that's turning Hawaii from an independent country, internationally recognized, into a territory, a protectorate of the United States through violence and through, backing that up with, in this case, the Navy and, evidently the Marines. So what I want you guys to get out of this, strong note here, by 1913, which is an election year, by 1913, the people of the United States want isolationism. That becomes a political issue. Write that down. Because of these various examples of bad imperialism, the American people embrace isolationism as a political issue. If you're an American politician, you have to be basically isolationist. Wilson had no trouble with that. He was a conservative, and we'll talk about that later. And Taft was leaning towards conservatism, and he'd had to contend with all this stuff. So he agrees with isolationism as well. Later, we'll talk about the United States getting involved in the First World War, and we have to overcome isolationism. Now, I'm foreshadowing a little bit. The United States is not going to get anything out of the First World War. Nothing. And so, we're not going to want to get into international affairs in the 1920s and the 1930s with the rise of the dictators. As late as 1941, we will also be deeply isolationist as a people. And so FDR in 1940, 1941 can foresee the war's about to happen. And he's desperately trying to get us ready for a conflict, a major conflict. And so trying to build up our military did pass, and that did happen, but Congress only passed those laws and the budget that goes with it with really, really tiny margins, 1 or 2 vote margins. And so the people, broadly speaking, and the politicians were strongly isolationist all the way up until December 1941, when the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. So isolationism will be an effective, and that's going to be an important issue going forward. All right, the next slide is just a closeout and the conclusions. So, in conclusion, American imperialism, 1898, 1920, Spanish-American War, Philippines insurrection, we talked about that, Panama Canals, banana republics. World War I is not part of American imperialism, but it will have to do with isolationism. And at the end of World War I, which is the next presentation, we will return to isolationism. So thank you very much for your attention in class and online. You should be getting ready for the first midterm test. And so American imperialism is the last major event that will appear on the test. So study hard. If you need to take a look at any one of these presentations, they're listed as 1302. If you need to take a look at any one of them again, please feel free to do so. And I will see you in the next presentation, which will deal with World War I.